Hello, and welcome to another edition of Here We Are. I'm your host, Tanita Cheatham. Thank you so much for tuning in. It seems like a week never goes by lately that you don't see in the newspaper or hear on the radio or see on television a story about the problems with the police department as well as prosecutorial misconduct. How did it get so bad? Now, many would argue that it's always been that way, but it seems lately that it has reached epidemic proportions. How did it get so bad? What can we do about it? These and other questions are issues we're going to talk to our next guest about, and he is certainly no stranger to our program. He is Attorney Judge Pincham. Thank you so much for coming to the program.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You're one of the people who have said, or have gone on record to state that, yes, these are problems that have happened for a long time, but it seems like this wave, this epidemic has, it seems to be worse. What are some of your reasons for that?
My reasons for saying it are the reasons that occurred. It is worse. It's obviously worse now than it was years ago.
Well, let's set the scenario. You said that every 15, 20 years, it's like an ebb and flow type effect. We have stories that come out about issues within the criminal justice system, and then they kind of get swept under the rug.
Ever since I've been in the practice, I was admitted to the bar on the 18th of June, 1951. And was at 49 years. And in the 49 years I have been in the profession, every, 12, 14, or 15 years, there has to be a cleansing process of the justice system, of the police department, of the judiciary, and the time is now come again for a cleansing. We go back to the years ago when Boyle was the state's attorney of Cook County, Illinois, a very fine prosecuting attorney, and one of the police investigators on his staff, a man by the name of Moretti, killed 2 people and shot a 3rd, and they tried to sweep it under the rug, and a special prosecutor was appointed to investigate it and prosecute Moretti. In fact, the Boyle first assistant, whose name, if I recall, was Breen, presented the case to the grand jury, and the grand jury came back with a no true bill. It did not indict him, and public furor was so intense that a special prosecutor was appointed to prosecute Moretti, and he was convicted of the crime of murder, and that kind of cleansed out the office for a few years. We had the Summerdale episode, if you recall, maybe you're too young, when police officers were conspiring with a burglar to commit burglaries in the Summerdale Police District. The officers who were supposedly guarding the various stores and businesses in the district were committing burglaries, and when Morris was his name, if I recall correctly, Morris or Morrissey was the burglar, was arrested for some other offense, and when he exposed it, nobody believed him. And yet, when they convinced the office that it was accurate, they went out and with search warrants and searched some of the policemen's homes. In the policemen's homes, they had the materials that they had stolen, the burglars: carpets, draperies, silver, china, vacuum cleaners.
In the police homes?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, these officers were prosecuted by a special prosecutor and were convicted. You recall when Wilson was brought in to revamp the police department. And if I recall correctly, it rose out of the Summerdale case. And Wilson became the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, and it did well for time. Later, if you recall, 1968, was it, when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were murdered over at on West Monroe, and a special prosecutor was brought in, Barnabas Sears, to prosecute that case, and although they were not convicted, it did serve as a cleansing process of the Chicago Police Department and of the state's attorney's office. We'll do again for it. A cleansing and a appointment of a special prosecutor.
Okay, I was about to say, there's a theme through all this. Stuff didn't start to happen until what? A special prosecutor was brought in.
Well, that's right. And the reason for that is relatively simple. And yet it is, it's somewhat convoluted and complicated. When the framers of the Constitution of this nation met in Philadelphia, to draft the Constitution, one of the major concerns was that they did not want a national police force.
Local.
When the 13 colonies were being brought together as one nation, the fear was that if they had a national police force, it could be used by the head of government to become a dictator. And the decision was therefore made that we would leave the law enforcement to the communities. And by having independent law enforcement groups in each community, without the unity that would be necessary, that law enforcement would never be a threat to the freedoms of the people. Mm-hmm. And by and large, that's true. The problem then arose, who would police the police? And the decision was made that the policing of the police would have to be left up to the people. The people would be the persons responsible for policing the police. And we're at the point now where the people are being called upon and insisting upon the police being policed. That is, police are not going to police themselves.
Mm-hmm. Let me get this straight. You're saying the cry is coming from the communities. Yes. Not from within, but the communities, okay?
Yes. Well, it's coming from the community because the community is witnessing the reality that the police will not police themselves.
And turning on them.
That's exactly correct. You are aware that since 1977, the reinstitution of death penalty, more men have been released from death row, 13, after having been convicted for crimes that they did not commit, than those men who have been executed. Only 12 men have been executed since 1977, whereas 13 have been released from death row. Not only released from death row, but released, period, because they were unjustly convicted, most of them on fabricated, concocted, perjured testimony of police officers. Mm. Now, let me hasten to say to you and to your viewing audience that I am not here to criticize law enforcement. I'm here to criticize those members of law enforcement who violate the law. Mm-hmm. And it is certainly an erroneous position to take that all policemen are good. It is an erroneous position to take that all policemen are law-abiding and God-fearing. It is an erroneous position to take that all lawyers are good, God-fearing, law-abiding persons. It's an erroneous position to take that all judges. We know the Gray Lord episode. Judges were convicted and sentenced to jail. Lawyers have been convicted and sentenced to jail. Policemen have been convicted and sentenced to jail. And indeed, clergymen have been convicted and sentenced to jail. That does not indict the legal profession. That's no indictment against all lawyers, no indictment against all clergymen, no indictment against all policemen, and no indictment against all judges. But it makes society come to grips with the reality that simply by virtue of the vocation or the profession that a person has chosen does not make that person inherently honest, fair, and compassionate. They're still humans. And there's a necessity to police any agency, any vocation, any profession. And of our society, it is the police that are less policed than any other agency. Well, that's one of the problems.
Someone would argue that the Office of Professional Standards would do something like that.
The Office of Professional Standards is incompetent and inept because, why? They're police. You got police policing the police. They are still police. The Office of Internal Affairs of the Chicago Police Department, they're still police. And their loyalties and their fidelities are with their brother officers. The legal profession, lawyers under the canon of ethics, are now, within the past, 10 years since the Himmel decision by the Illinois Supreme Court, and I think it was a very wise decision, the canon of ethics require a lawyer to report misconduct of another lawyer if I know about it. Not only am I required to report it, but if I don't report it, I have violated the canon of ethics by not reporting it, and I can be prosecuted before the Attorney Registration and Discipline Commission for not reporting it. So lawyers are policing lawyers. The same thing is true of judges. If I find out, or if a lawyer finds out that a judge is violating his oath of office, he is obligated to report it. And there is a constitutional agency in our government that polices and prosecutes the judiciary.
But there's none.
The Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board brings charges against judges before the Courts Commission. Those are constitutional offices. The Attorney Registration and Discipline Commission brings charges and police lawyers. I would suppose that the deacon board in a church polices the minister. The Office of Professional Standards of the state of Illinois police doctors. If a doctor violates his oath, or if he's guilty of malpractice and it is found out, he can be prosecuted before the Office of Professional Standards. And the state of Illinois, in giving him his license, can take his license back if they find that he has violated his oath of office. Same is true in the field of dentistry. But there is no agency that is set up meaningfully, independent of police to police the police.
How did we get to this point? How did we get here?
Well, it's deep, deep rooted. It's very deep rooted. And the reality is, we are taught from the moment we are able to go out into the yard to play, really, in school, to trust the police. I recognize that there is some skepticism on the part of many members of the community now in that area, but when the persons who are teaching the children now, who have the skepticism when they came along, it was a general proposition: trust the police. If you get lost, don't ask a stranger how to get home, ask the police. If you lose your car fare and you need car fare to get home, don't ask a stranger, ask the police. When we're in school, we are taught to respect the rule of law. The reality is, democracy works only because of the respect that the people have for the rule of law. That's why it's a democracy. Freedom comes about because of the respect that the citizens have for the rule of law. The reason you don't rob me is not because you're afraid of me. It isn't because you're afraid that you'll get caught. There may be a feeling that you might be, but the basic reason you don't rob me is because of the rule of law. It's wrong. So the moral fiber within you dictates that you don't violate the law. Not because you're going to get caught, but because you've been taught morality. Don't do this, it's wrong. Don't do this, it's immoral. Don't do this, it's a criminal act. And a democratic society can only exist when the people feel that way about the rule of law.
But because the police officers don't have that, then they don't feel they have to respect it.
The reality is, if you don't have that respect for the rule of law, democracy cannot exist. And the reality is that confidence in the justice system is an essential ingredient in our democratic society. Let me give you this demonstration of what I'm talking about. Monday morning, I would estimate that there would be probably 10,000 people going to court.
In this city?
In this city. And if you add the civil side, it's probably 20,000 in some court Monday morning. Defendants, witnesses, victims, and support, family supports, friend supports. They go to that tribunal that the government and society has designated to settle disputes, the courts. And they go there because they feel they're going to get a fair shake. They feel that the outcome is going to be just. Society has said to me, if you do something to me, to which I object, we are not to resolve the differences here in the studio. Society says, Pincham, take her to court, or go call the police, and the police will take her to the police station, and she'll be charged with an offense, and Monday morning we go to court and resolve it. Society demands that. Now, we could go out in the alley. We could say, okay, let's settle in the alley. Let's don't call the police. Or let's go home and settle it. Let's go down on Madison and State and settle it. But the reason we go to court, the reason these defendants go to court, and I've been preaching this sermon for 50 years, is not because they're afraid. Defendants who are on bond for some of the most hideous offenses known to the law, they return on their bonds because they have respect for the system. They believe that they will be treated fairly. And they are willing to accept the punishment for what they have done when they are proven guilty fairly. They feel that even if they didn't commit the offense, they will not be convicted. And even sometimes when they do commit the offense, they will not be convicted because of the rules of law that have been created for the protection of the innocent. Once they began to feel, once victims began to think that they will not be treated fairly in a courtroom, either civilly or in a criminal case, once defendants in criminal cases began to feel and think that they will not be treated fairly, they won't go to court, and you can't blame them for not going. Why should they go? Why would they go? If a person is charged with a robbery and he knows he didn't commit it, and when he gets to court, he knows that the police is lying on him to convict him,
why go?
Why go?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Conversely, if he goes to court and he knows he did it and he can bribe the policeman and get out of it, his respect for the rule of law has been destroyed. So what I am saying to you and your viewing audience is, it is the respect for the rule of law with which we all have been indoctrinated and instilled that enables the democratic process to work.
Okay. We'll talk more about that right after we take a break. Stay tuned. And we're back. We are joined on this edition by Attorney Judge Eugene Pincham. We're talking about the Illinois criminal justice system, the reason why there is being allowed to have so many malfeasances wreaked throughout the system. Let's hit upon a couple of points. You have stated, and many people support you, that there needs to be a federal investigation of the Illinois criminal justice system.
That is correct. That should be. There should be. There's no question there should be. Mm-hmm. Those 13 men who've been released from death row, you can't expect the state's attorney to investigate those cases honestly and fairly and justly. It can't be done by him. It should be done by an independent investigator from the Department of Justice who has the resources and the means of doing an accurate, independent, honest, just investigation. Mm-hmm. It's desperately needed.
Mm-hmm. And we just talked about, in the whole scheme of things, there were other points that within the whole investigation of the criminal justice system, there are particular points in there, videotaping of interrogations from beginning to end. As we said, moratorium on the death penalty, which has already happened. Somehow, some way to stop racial profiling. You know, it's big in Highland Park, but it happens all over the place. So we'll start at one point and keep going.
Listen, Highland Park, it's big in Highland Park now because a white policeman has come forward and acknowledged that it exists. But it's not as large in Highland Park as it is in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Go to 321 North LaSalle Street Monday morning. That's the traffic court. And you see people lined up 3 abreast, a block deep, and 95% of them are blacks and Hispanics. Mm-hmm. You would think that when you go to traffic court that either white people all know how to drive, or white people are not driving in Chicago.
Because of these are the people that fill the court.
Traffic court is comprised of offenders, alleged offenders, basically 95% are black and Hispanics, period.
And the majority of the police officers that bring them there?
Well, the majority of the police officers bring them there are white, because the majority of the police officers in Chicago are white. You have 13,000 policemen in Chicago and 10,000 are white. Although blacks constitute 1,100,000 of the population, whites constitute 1 million. Blacks outnumber Chicago, whites in the city of Chicago, according to the 1990 census.
You have been defending wrongfully accused victims, families of the victims for many years. And in all these cases, I mean, I'm sure, and you can explain too, go into detail about some of the horrid stuff that happens within those things. But is there a common thread that goes through each case? Do you find a common thread that goes through each case?
Well, the common denominator, I won't say of each case, and I'm not avoiding a question, I'm trying to see if we're on the same page, we're on the same street. By far the majority of the alleged offenders in our Cook County criminal justice system are blacks. A good 85% are blacks. Hispanics take up the remaining 15%. They are usually between 25 to 38 years of age. They are recidivists. They have been in the system before. Very rarely has an offender finished high school. Very rarely has that offender participated in the high school extracurricular activity or sport. The offense usually is committed within a radius of 10 blocks of his residence. And tragically, it is committed upon one of his neighbors in the community, another black. Tragically, the system that is bringing him into the court, the power structure of the system, that is the police, the prosecutor, the judge, the lockup keeper, the jailer, is white. And don't get angry with me for saying it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. But those are the facts. We have a state's attorney's office now with over 1,000 prosecutors in that office, 1,000 assistant state's attorneys. We don't have a single first chair felony black trial assistant state's attorney in Cook County. They tell me we may now have one. All of the first chair felony trial assistant state's attorney, perhaps with the exception of one, is white.
You need to explain what that position entails.
The position entails he is the or she is the prosecutor who is responsible for the prosecution in that courtroom. The first chair felony trial assistant is the boss of the prosecutors in that courtroom. That first chair felony assistant determines what recommendations will be made on a plea. He determines what charges will be dropped against the defendant. He determines really what cases have priority to be tried. And he, in fact, is the major trial assistant in that courtroom. And the advantage to him is, of course, he is the boss. The advantage being, he gets the trial experience. And again, he is the one who dictates the terms of disposing of the cases. Another advantage, which is a monumental advantage, is that when he leaves the office, with the experience he has the credentials for going into a high priority law firm with the accompanying accoutrements for going there. And we don't have a black bear. And yet, as I said, 85% of the people who are being prosecuted in the court system and 85% of the victims are blacks.
And I think out of that spurs...
And literally 100% of the prosecutors are white.
Are white. And in that spurs the debate over the need for videotaping of interrogations from beginning to end.
Well, we certainly must have videotaping of inmates and defendants and arrestees in a police station.
What has been some of the instances where you felt that that was really needed?
In every instance in which there's a confession, it should have been videotaped. Then there's no debate as to whether or not, first, the defendant said it. Then there's no debate, secondly, as to the circumstances in which he said it. Thirdly, there's no debate as to whether or not it is authentic and valid or a result of a product of coercion or intimidation. There's no excuse for not videotaping interrogations, except it will expose to the public and to the jury and to the judges the conduct engaged in which some officers engaged in extracting confessions. That's the objection to it. They may not tell you that. Okay. But the bottom line is they talk about the cost and who's going to run the machine, all this kind of nonsense. But if 7-Eleven can videotape the 24 hours they open, everybody coming in the store, if Jewel Osco can tape even on the parking lot, you go to Jewel Osco parking lot now, they got the cameras up flashing all over the store. They're taping everything. And it should be. And in fact, jurors should be reluctant to convict anybody on a confession that is not videotaped. And should ask the question, why is it not videotaped? If a defendant is voluntarily, freely confessing, wanting to get it off his chest, wanting to make amends for his wrong, then why don't you say, well, let's put it on the video?
Let's talk about that. Will you speak to some of the instances of what goes on in the police rooms, in your experience, in interrogation rooms?
The police officers will tell a defendant, it's going to be better for you to tell me what happened. Nothing's going to happen to you if you tell me what happens. Your friend over there is putting it all on you, so you better tell me what happened so you won't take the weight by yourself. All kinds of gimmicks are being employed. If you don't tell us what happened, we're going out and arrest your mother. You don't want to embarrass your mother and all this by us bringing her in. Brute force is often employed, as you well know, with the Burge case. It doesn't take much to intimidate a person who's already afraid in the first place by being in a police station, being confined and in prison, and being in an environment in which you don't have friends and where everybody in the environment is perceived to be your enemy. And policemen will play the good guy, bad guy with the defendant and prevail upon a defendant or an accused to make statements. And the danger is, one, it violates the integrity of the process, because we're not supposed to obtain evidence through illegal means and methods. To do that is just as bad as what the criminal himself is accused of having done. Secondly, it induces law enforcement to take shortcuts. You don't have to go out and investigate a crime, just bring the man in here and beat the hell out of him. He'd tell you he did it, and then go to court, and the judge is going to say, well, the police wouldn't lie on this man, Mr. Pincham. He must have done it because he said he did it, and he's on his way to the penitentiary. Case in point, with which I'm sure you're familiar, Eddie Huggins. A young woman was found murdered in an abandoned apartment building up on the far north side. Blood was seeping from her mouth and her ears and what have you. Matter of fact, I said seeping, I should have said profusely. She was bleeding profusely from her head and her mouth. And she's lying in a pool of blood about her head. And within 2 hours after this girl's body was found, the police officers arrested Eddie Huggins, a 15-year-old kid. Within 2 hours after they had arrested him, he had made a 15 or 16-page confession of the murder to an assistant state's attorney and to the arresting officers, in which he described the knife, how he got the knife with which he stabbed her, where he found it, where he obtained it. He described the handle and the blade, the length of the blade, the width of the handle. He described how he stabbed the woman in the head repeatedly, how she fell when he stabbed her, and how he stabbed after she fell on the ground, and how he left her lying in a pool of blood when he ran out of the building, and where he threw the knife away after he left the building. And he signed the confession. 2 hours later, the Cook County medical examiner has conducted an autopsy on the deceased, call the police, and tell the police that this young lady did not die from a stab wound. he informs the police that the lady died from blunt trauma to her abdomen. And more importantly, he informed the police, not only did she not die of a stab wound, she didn't have any cuts or stab wounds anywhere on her body. No place. 2 days later, the police go before the grand jury and report to the grand jury that Eddie Huggins has confessed to stabbing the woman to death. And the grand jury indicts him for the murder. The officers do not tell the grand jury that the coroner has reported to them, or that the pathologist has reported to them, that the woman did not die of a stab wound.
They didn't even bring it up.
Didn't bring it up, didn't mention it. This young man is in jail for 15 months. 15 months he's in jail, awaiting trial. When the case is publicized, Andre Grant and I then go into the case. Relative parents of this Eddie Huggins come and see us, and we go and talk to him. And you would think that once we got into the case and once we have exposed to the prosecutor what I've just related to you, that they would say, all right, we'll dismiss the charges. But no, they don't do that. They proceed to try this young man. We were on trial in this case 3 days.
Because it would have made them look bad to come right out and say.
No, it wouldn't, because it make them look good. You're doing the honest thing. It's honest to stand up and say, we made a mistake. The state attorney's office is not supposed to be perfect. Police are not supposed to be perfect. Of course, in this case, obviously, somebody's framing this boy. Somebody lied on him. Somebody prevailed upon him if he did say this, and of course, to say it, and obviously it was a lie, because the woman didn't die from a stab wound. That's just one of the many cases I can tell you about.
And you've worked with and dealt with a lot of them. You know, it's interesting that we, the public, don't know more about this kind of thing. Now, lately in the media, mainstream media, and even local newspapers, they're talking, you know, focusing on it. But do you think that you're scratching the surface? Do you think they really get into
They're
the
only scratching the surface. They're only scratching the surface. And indeed, we should be grateful to the media for even scratching the surface. Because if by scratching the surface, we can get an investigator from the Justice Department or an investigation from the Department of Justice to come in and scratch the surface further and further expose these violations and transgressions by law enforcement officers and clean it up, we'd be the better off. The Ford Heights Four. A white man and a white woman were found brutally murdered in Ford Heights. 4 young black brothers were told that they were suspected, and they voluntarily went into the station. And they went in with anticipation, hoping that they would establish their innocence and remove any suspicion from them. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. They were arrested and charged with these 2 murders on concocted, fabricated, lying evidence by the policeman in the case. You may look at me and say, how do you know that? How could you dare say that? Well, they were convicted and sentenced to die, 2 of them. 2 of them were sentenced to long prison terms, if I recall correctly, life. 2 of them on death row for 18 years. And lo and behold, finally the true 3 murderers came forward and confessed to having committed the murders. Confessed that the 4 men who had been convicted did not commit the murders. And based upon their confessions and other evidence involved, the true 3 offenders were sentenced to imprisonment and are now in prison, and the Ford Heights 4 have been released from custody. Not only have they been released from custody, but they filed a lawsuit against the Cook County Sheriff's officers who framed them into the death row and into the penitentiary. A former assistant state's attorney was hired by the sheriff's office to represent these officers, a guy by the name of Shabbat, And he did so, and he made a couple of $1 million and didn't even go to trial in the case. A couple of $1 million of your and my money.
Mm-hmm.
And they settled the case without trial. Flint Taylor and the People's Law Office did a whale of a job in representing these fellows, both in the criminal case and in the civil case. And the county has agreed to give the Fort Heights Four $36 million as a settlement. Taxpayers' money. An acknowledgement, what? That they were framed. They were framed. Now, the tragedy doesn't stop there. The tragedy is the officers who framed them are still law enforcement officers.
And wasn't the commander, was that a John Burge?
No, that was not a John Burge.
Okay.
Burge is the one who framed so many.
And that's a story within itself.
Yeah, and he's now in Florida on retirement. But the tragedy in the Fort Heights Four is that these officers from the Sheriff's Department are still carrying weapons and badges and are engaged in law enforcement and have not been criminally prosecuted and have not been removed from the Office of Law Enforcement.
Now, it's interesting because in the Serena Daniels case and the Russ case, the officers were reprimanded, lost their jobs.
Well, in the Russ case, the officer didn't lose his job. Now, you have to understand the difference. And if your viewing audience does not grasp the distinction, all hope is lost. And the distinction is what? In the Russ case, there were people who saw it. There were witnesses. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are we together? Mm-hmm. We're on the same page?
Yes.
In the Haggerty case, in the Daniels case, there were what? Witnesses. People saw it. In the Fort Heights Four, there were no witnesses. The people are dead. When the four men go into the police station and are coerced into trying to make them confess, there are no witnesses. In the Eddie Huggins case, the only witness is the state's attorney and the police officer. In the Ryan Harris case, and the public has not yet been told the true, complete story about that case, and the 7- and 8-year-old boys who were accused of sexually molesting and murdering Ryan Harris, these children didn't confess. That was a pure, unadulterated concoction, fabricated lie by two police officers who wanted the accolades and the glory for solving the case. And I'm not talking about what Pincham says, or I'm not basing that upon what the two children say, or what the witnesses say. The police reports show that these children were framed. And the confession that is attributed to them by the policeman contradicts the facts of the homicide as to the date, the time, the place, and the method.
Now, you know, whenever we sit down and have discussions, I get so wrapped into what you're saying, we lose track of time, and we're running out of time. But one thing I do want to get in, and one point I do want you to hit upon is, what can citizens do to help facilitate this process?
My sermon to my people is, since the beginning of civilization, the power structure that engages in oppressed people are able to do so by keeping the oppressed people from becoming involved in the political process. You cannot have oppression of people who are involved and engaged in the political process. It cannot happen. What am I saying?
Get involved.
What am I saying? Since the beginning of time, for 300 years, for example, in South Africa, when the Dutch and the Germans invaded South Africa and they had the vicious wars with the Zulus and what have you, and they won the war simply because they had superior firepower, the first thing that they did was took control of government and refused to allow the native Africans to participate. And for 300 years in South Africa, blacks could own property, go to school, not as much as they should have, but they could. Get PhDs in physics, chemistry, testify in court. They could even intermarry. They could buy cars. They could wear fancy jewelry. They could go on vacations. They could gamble. They could lounge at the resorts. They could buy the best of clothing. They could live in the best of housing accommodation. But the one thing they could not do, and that is participate in government. They couldn't vote. They couldn't vote. And the same thing was true in our country for a long time. I grew up in an area of the country where we could not vote. The civil rights struggle in which I was engaged, by and large, was for the right of our people to vote. When Dr. King made the famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, and the power structure is deliberately misleading our people about it today, it wasn't the speech that was important. I'm not minimizing it was a great oratorical oration, no debate about it, but it wasn't important. Had he said the same thing in the bathroom taking a shower, "I have a dream," it would be unimportant. Had he said the same thing brushing his teeth in the bathroom, it's unimportant. What was important was that there were 500,000 people there to hear the speech. The people were there demonstrating, protesting to their government under their constitutional right, redressing their grievances because they didn't have the right to vote. And as a result of that demonstration, and many people are unaware of this, a voting rights bill was passed, eliminating the restrictions and inhibitions that were imposed against black people, particularly in the South, against voting. The poll tax was eliminated. The grandfather's clause to vote was eliminated. The literacy test was eliminated. People could vote just by signing their names. And as a result of that, since 1965, Voting Rights Bill, what has happened? The political structure of the South has completely changed. Why? Because black people can vote. In Birmingham, Alabama, you have a black mayor.
Jackson, Mississippi, you have a mayor.
Jackson, Mississippi, you have a black mayor. New Orleans, Louisiana, you have a black mayor. They're participating in government. Richmond, Virginia, you have a black mayor. Atlanta, Georgia, a black mayor. And the advantage of that, of course, is what? You control the police department, you control the fire department, you control the court system, you control the airports. The fact of the matter is, the young lady who was here earlier talking about, what's the word,
entrepreneurship.
Say it again.
Entrepreneurship.
You have blacks in Hartford, is it Hartford Airport in Atlanta, who are becoming millionaires, just selling newspapers, selling popcorn. Because why? They control government. The city budget of Chicago, annual city budget of Chicago is $4 billion a year. That's being controlled by, not us, by somebody else. So would you ask me? My people must participate in the electorate. They must vote. That's what they need to do. They must vote.
Because then they vote in the people that make the changes.
Of course, you run it, you control it. You control the judiciary, you control the state's attorney's office, you control the police department.
It wouldn't be 1,000 state's attorney,
That's
first chair
exactly
state's attorney.
Not only do you control it, but it provides jobs for us. It provides jobs for black people. There are 1,100,000 black people in the city of Chicago. We don't have our fair share of the political plums. Politicians run for government, run for political office, by and large, for a reason.
Not to make money, but power.
Well, some of that to make money too.
Well,
some of that because they need a job.
Well, in light
but
of
and I would suggest you to say that Daley needs a job. He has to work. Well, he does. You think he's well? If he didn't, why didn't he give his salary to charity? I'm not suggesting he should, but I'm only pointing out to you he needs a job. That's why he's the mayor. He needs a job. First, the power is second. Now, there are some politicians who are doing it for power, who don't need money. Multi-billionaires, of course. But we must participate in the electorate. And as you know, when Mandela was released from custody and the Africans got the right to vote, after 27 years in jail, Mandela became the president of his nation. And the ballot that was used in South Africa for the first time, when black people could vote, because they were illiterate, the ballot has the pictures of the candidates on the ballot, because people couldn't read. And they had the emblem of the parties on the ballot. And people went to the polls and put an X by Mandela's picture. And they stood in line for days to vote. Many of them fell out, many of them exhausted from the heat, malnutrition, no water. And a journalist asked one of the persons standing in line, "It's hot out here, isn't it?" The man said, "Yeah." "And you're tired out?" He said, "Out here, yes." "Been standing out here a long time, haven't you?" He said, "Yes." "It's uncomfortable?" He said, "Yes." "You want to vote?" He said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you been waiting to vote?" He said, 300 years. 300 years.
We need some of that passion back here in America.
Well, I would say to your viewing audience, why did the framers of the Constitution, or why has our government made it mandatory to pay your taxes? If you don't pay your taxes and support your government, you will what? Go to jail. Period. Period. It's mandatory. In time of war, induction into the armed forces is what? Mandatory. You're called upon to take a gun, go across the water, and subject yourself to being killed, or kill somebody you've never seen before. And if you had the chance to talk to them, you'd probably be the best of friends. But it's mandatory. And yet voting is voluntary. Why?
Oh, you asked me the question. You've been answering all your own questions there. I don't know if you were asking me. It's the choice. I mean, you have the choice to pick the people that you want to have in there.
Why wouldn't the government say, if taxes are mandatory, why is voting mandatory? If conscription in the armed forces is mandatory, if you can make me go get killed, then why can't you make me vote?
Because you can vote the people that you want to have voted in.
Well, you vote for who you want to vote for, but make it mandatory that you vote. They don't want you to vote. The power structure does not want full participation in the electorate. Why? Because it enables people to be oppressed. It's just that simple. It's just that simple. And when you have people who are indifferent to it, uninformed about it, and ignorant of it, it makes it just that much easier.
What are some of the things that you're dealing with now? Some of the issues that you are... We hit upon them earlier.
Well, I'm working now on the Anthony Porter case. Anthony Porter is a man who was supposed to have killed 2 people in Washington Park back in 1982. The policeman framed him, presented perjured, concocted evidence against him, had a witness lie on him. He was on death row for over 15 years. During a great portion of which, at least 12 years of which, he was locked in an 8x10 cell with no lights, no heat, unbearably cold in the winter, unbearably hot in the summer, sleeping on a metal slab with very little padding, a mattress on it. His vision became impaired. He was scheduled to die on the 23rd of September, 1998. 99. And 2 days before his scheduled death, the true murderer confessed to the crime. He was brought to court and confessed in open court that he committed the crimes, and received a sentence of 37 years imprisonment, for which Anthony Porter had received the death penalty. He's out now. So there's no debate that the policeman framed him. There's no debate that the policeman concocted evidence against him. And there's no debate that the officers who did so are still on the police force, still walking around with guns and badges, sworn to uphold the law and to serve and to protect. They ought to be in jail. They ought not to be on the police force. And we are working diligently now to try to remove them from the police force and to remove them to the penitentiary where they ought to be.
There needs to be a policing of the police.
Yes, ma'am.
Judge Pincham, as always a joy to have you on, always a wealth of information, our guru on different issues that we do cover. And as always, the door is always open for you to come back, and there's always a chair for you to sit to talk to us about the issues that you deal with.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of Here We Are. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I'd also like to thank my guest, Attorney Judge Eugene Pincham, who is always welcomed on the program, and we always have a great time. As always, until next time, God bless.